19 years old, and Delia Mercer owned nothing in this world but the clothes on her back, a tin cup, and $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat.
Steady now.
The man who cast her
Let the
out was her
blade
own
do the
father's
work.
brother, Warren Tolliver, who told her plainly on a gray
There you
October
go, much
morning in
better.
1891 that a grown woman with no husband and no trade was a debt he could no longer afford to carry. She walked out of that house in Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming territory, with everything she owned in a flour sack, and by the time she reached the rail yard at the edge of town, 4 of those $11 had gone to a room above the feed store she could not keep for more than a week. It was there, standing in the cold beside the rusted spur line where the Great Basin and Western Railroad had once run its branch cars, that she saw it, a derelict wooden railroad car, its paint long since surrendered to weather, its wheels sunk half into weeds, offered by the station master for the price of scrap lumber. $7, he said, and she could have it and whatever was inside, for nobody had claimed it in 15 years. It seemed, to anyone watching, the most foolish purchase a penniless girl could make. But sealed inside the walls of that forgotten car was something that would not only rewrite the whole of Delia Mercer's future, but would settle a debt owed to an entire town, a debt 15 years old and long since given up as unpayable. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Delia Mercer. And if you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, a town, a home, a season of your life, tell us in the comments because this story was written for you. Delia had been raised in the workshop behind her father's house, and the workshop smelled always of cedar shavings and linseed oil, a smell she would carry in her memory long after the shop itself belonged to someone else. Thomas Mercer had been a wheelwright and a fine carpenter, a man with square hands and patient eyes, and from the time Delia was old enough to hold a chisel without cutting herself, he had taught her his trade as though she were the son he never had. She learned to read the grain of a board the way other girls learned to read scripture, learned that a plank that looked plain and gray on the outside might hide, beneath its weathered face, wood as fine and true as anything freshly milled. Her father used to say that most people judged a thing only by its surface, and that was the tragedy of the world. Good wood thrown on the burn pile because nobody troubled to look closer, good people overlooked because nobody troubled to ask their story. Delia absorbed this the way she absorbed the smell of sawdust, until it became not just a lesson but a way of seeing. She learned dovetail joints before she learned her multiplication tables, learned to sand a chair leg until it gleamed like poured honey, learned that craftsmanship left fingerprints, small telling marks that a trained eye could read like handwriting. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it was only ever Delia and her father in that little house at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, a town that had sprung up 20 years before around the promise of the railroad, a promise that had only half arrived. The Great Basin and Western had run a spur line through the valley in the early 70s, and for a few golden years the town had believed itself on the cusp of prosperity, before the railroad's interest moved elsewhere and left Larkspur Hollow with a half-built depot, a scatter of abandoned rolling stock, and a bitterness that never quite faded. Thomas Mercer had built furniture for the townsfolk and coffins when it was needed and cradles when it was needed more, and Delia grew up knowing every family by the furniture in their homes, knowing the Ashworths by their oak table and the Finches by their cherrywood hope chest, knowing that her father's hands had touched nearly every household in that valley in some quiet, lasting way. It was a good life, if a spare one, and Delia believed it would go on that way, she at her father's side learning the trade, perhaps one day marrying a man who would let her keep working wood with her own hands, which most men would not. But in the spring of 1890, a fever came through Larkspur Hollow the way fevers sometimes do, arriving without warning and leaving without mercy, and Thomas Mercer was one of the 11 souls it took. Delia was 18 then and grief-struck and utterly unprepared for what came next, which was her father's brother Warren Tolliver arriving from Cheyenne within the month, claiming guardianship of both her and the workshop, since her father had left no will and the law in those days did not look kindly upon an unmarried woman inheriting property outright. Warren was a man who had made his way as a land agent and, more recently, as a foreman and enforcer for the very railroad company that had abandoned Larkspur Hollow years before, and he looked at his brother's workshop and saw not a legacy but an asset, something to be sold for its lumber and tools and the debt it might settle. Delia begged him to let her keep it, told him she could run it herself, could keep the accounts and take the commissions, but Warren only laughed the particular laugh of a man who has already decided a thing and is merely enjoying the pretense of discussion. Within a year he had sold the workshop to a saddler from the next county, pocketed the money against what he called her father's debts, debts Delia never saw proof of, and kept her on in his own household as an unpaid keeper of his hearth, a arrangement she endured because she had nowhere else to go and because some stubborn, grieving part of her still hoped that blood might eventually count for something. It did not count for long. Warren Tolliver's position with the Great Basin and Western had grown more important than anyone in Larkspur Hollow realized, for the railroad, having abandoned its spur line 15 years before, had recently found new interest in the valley on account of a coal seam discovered in the hills above the old Kestrel survey grounds, and Warren had been sent back to oversee what the company delicately called land consolidation, the buying up or forcing out of homesteaders whose claims sat across the surveyed right-of-way. It was ugly work, and it paid well, and it left Warren with little patience for a niece who ate his food and slept under his roof and reminded him daily of a brother he had never much liked to begin with. The end came on an October morning without much ceremony. Warren informed Delia over a cold breakfast that he had taken a wife-to-be in Cheyenne, a widow with her own grown children, and that there was no place in his new arrangement for a spinster niece who contributed nothing but expense. He gave her $11, which he called generous, and told her she was a grown woman now and would have to make her own way, the same way he had. Delia did not argue. She had learned, in the years since her father's death, that arguing with Warren Tolliver was like arguing with a closed door. The effort exhausted you and the door remained closed regardless. She packed her few belongings into a flour sack, took the $11, and walked out into a cold Wyoming morning with the particular hollow feeling of a person who understands, all at once and completely, that she is entirely alone in the world. She found a room above the feed store for $4, a narrow space that smelled of grain dust and mouse droppings, and she lay awake that first night doing arithmetic in her head, $7 now standing between her and nothing at all, trying to calculate how many days $7 might buy a person in a town that had already decided, through its silence and its averted eyes, that Warren Tolliver's niece was not a person worth troubling over. It was the next morning, walking the frost-stiff road past the old rail yard to see if the mercantile needed help sweeping floors, that Delia saw the railroad car. It sat on a rusted length of siding track that had not seen a locomotive in more than a decade, half swallowed by dry grass and sagebrush, its once handsome paint scoured to bare silvered wood by 15 Wyoming winters. It had clearly been a private car once, not a common boxcar, for it had real windows, now clouded and cracked, and a small iron stove pipe jutting from its roof, and a narrow door with a brass handle gone green with age. Obadiah Finch, the elderly station master who still kept an office in the depot out of habit more than necessity, told her the car had belonged, many years before, to a railroad surveyor named Josiah Kestrel, a quiet, careful man who had come through in the early 70s to map the very spur line that had once promised Larkspur Hollow its fortune. Kestrel had lived in that car for the better part of 2 years while he worked, and then, in the winter of 1876, he had simply vanished, walked out one evening to check a survey marker in the hills and never returned, and though men had searched for a week, no trace of him was ever found, and the railroad company, in the businesslike way of such companies, had simply written him off, left his car on the siding, and moved its interests elsewhere. Nobody had wanted it since. It was not worth moving, not worth repairing, worth nothing but the lumber a man might strip from it, and Obadiah, needing to clear the siding for a section gang's tool car, told Delia she could have the whole thing, contents and all, for $7, which was less than the scrap wood was worth to anyone willing to do the work of tearing it down. Delia thought of her father, of his voice telling her that most people judged a thing only by its surface, and though every practical instinct told her that a girl with $7 to her name ought to be spending it on bread and boot leather rather than an abandoned rail car, some quieter instinct, some inheritance of her father's eye, told her to look closer. She paid Obadiah Finch his $7, and she walked the short distance to the siding, and she pried open the stiff brass-handled door, and she stepped for the first time into what would become, however unlikely it seemed on that cold morning, the beginning of an entirely different life. The inside of the car was dim and close and smelled of dust and old iron, but Delia's father had taught her to see past neglect to what lay beneath it, and what she saw, once her eyes adjusted, surprised her. The car had been fitted out with real craftsmanship, a fold-down bunk built into one wall, a small writing desk with a hinged lid, shelves with a lip along their edges to keep books from sliding when the car was in motion, all of it built by a hand that cared about more than mere function. Delia ran her fingers along the joinery of the built-in shelves the way her father had taught her to read a piece of furniture, and she felt, beneath years of grime, the unmistakable precision of dovetail joints, cut by someone who had trained as a fine woodworker before he had ever trained as a surveyor. It was the writing desk that caught her attention longest, for its proportions seemed subtly wrong to her trained eye, too deep for its outward dimensions, as though several inches of space had gone somewhere they ought not to have gone. She spent the better part of an hour running her hands over every surface of that desk, tapping it gently the way her father used to tap a plank to listen for the hollow note that meant rot, or sometimes meant something hidden. And there, along the back panel of the desk, behind what looked like a simple decorative molding, her fingers found a seam so fine it would have escaped any eye untrained in the particular language of good joinery. She pressed, and the molding shifted, and a narrow panel swung inward on a hinge no wider than a knife blade, and Delia Mercer, sitting alone in an abandoned railroad car on the coldest morning of her life, found herself looking into a hidden compartment that had waited 15 years for someone to think it worth the looking. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, Delia found a leather journal, its pages foxed but legible, and beneath it a rolled set of survey maps, and beneath those, wrapped separately and heavier than she expected, a small iron strongbox with a lock long since rusted to uselessness. She pried it open with a bit of scrap iron from the car floor, and inside lay a scattering of gold coins, more money than she had ever seen gathered in one place, along with a bundle of documents tied with ribbon, deeds, it seemed, filed and countersigned, and beneath them a letter, the ink faded but the hand careful and deliberate, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this, if I do not return." Delia read it there in the cold light coming through the clouded windows, and what she read changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about her town's history. Josiah Kestrel had written that he had been hired by the Great Basin and Western to survey the spur line through the valley, and that in the course of his work he had discovered that the railroad's officers, in league with a handful of distant investors, had deliberately falsified the survey filings so that the right-of-way and the adjoining mineral rights would fall entirely to the company rather than to the homesteaders who had settled the land first, under the government's own land grant promises. He had discovered, moreover, that the company had accepted federal land grant payment for improvements it never intended to make, money meant to build a proper depot and a spur to serve the settlers, money that had instead vanished into the accounts of men who never set foot in Wyoming. Kestrel wrote that he had gathered proof, the true survey, the falsified filings side-by-side correspondence he had intercepted and copied in his own hand, and that he intended to bring this proof to the land office in Cheyenne, but that he feared, with good reason, the men whose fraud he had uncovered, for he had already been followed twice on the road and once approached with an offer of money to simply let the matter lie. He had hidden the gold, his own savings, meant as restitution money he intended to distribute among the homesteaders whose claims had been stolen, should anything happen to him before he could see justice properly done, along with the true deeds and his evidence, in the one place he trusted absolutely, the compartment of his own hand-built desk, whose joinery he alone had cut and whose secret he alone knew. He had gone out that winter evening, the letter's final lines suggested, uneasy and half expecting not to return, and he had not returned, and no one had ever known why or where or at whose hand. Delia sat for a long while with the journal open on her lap, the cold forgotten, the ache of hunger forgotten, feeling the particular vertigo of a person who has stumbled, by accident and instinct, into the middle of a 15-year-old wound that an entire town still carried without quite naming it. She understood, turning the brittle pages, why Larkspur Hollow had always seemed to nurse a low, unexamined bitterness about the railroad, why old families spoke of the Kestrel survey with a kind of superstitious unease, why certain homestead boundaries had always been disputed in ways nobody could quite explain. She understood, too, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the car, that the coal seam recently discovered in those same hills, the very reason her Uncle Warren had been sent back to Larkspur Hollow to consolidate land claims, sat almost exactly atop the ground Kestrel's true survey had marked as belonging, by rights and by government promise, to families who still lived there, the Ashworths, the Finches, a dozen others whose furniture her own father had built with his own hands. The falsified filings Kestrel had uncovered 15 years before had never been corrected. They had simply been filed away, forgotten, and were now, unknowingly, the very papers her uncle relied upon to force those same families off land that had never rightfully belonged to the railroad at all. Delia realized, sitting alone in the cold with a dead man's letter in her hands, that she was holding the one thing capable of undoing 15 years of quiet theft, and that the man currently enforcing that theft, riding out to homesteads with eviction papers and railroad muscle, was her own uncle, the man who had cast her out 3 days before with $11 and a laugh. She did not act rashly, for her father had also taught her that valuable things required patient handling, the way a fine joint required careful, unhurried work rather than force. She spent the following days quietly, taking a small room's worth of comfort from the railroad car itself, for it was, whatever else it was, a roof over her head and a stove she could feed with scrap wood from the siding, and she used that shelter to study Kestrel's journal and maps by lamplight, cross-referencing them where she could against the plat book kept, of all places, in the depot office, which old Obadiah Finch let her examine without asking too many questions, for he had always had a soft spot for Thomas Mercer's girl. What she found confirmed everything Kestrel had written. The filed survey, the one the Great Basin and Western still relied upon, ran the boundary lines a full half-mile east of where Kestrel's true, more careful survey had placed them, a shift that happened to place the Ashworth homestead, the Finch claim, and 6 others squarely within railroad land rather than on the government-granted acreage those families had worked for 2 decades. Delia understood that she could not simply walk into town waving a dead man's journal, not against a company with lawyers in Cheyenne and an enforcer with her own family name, and so she began, carefully and quietly, to build her case the way her father had once built a chair. Piece by piece, joint by joint, testing each part before trusting it to bear weight. Word travels fast in a small town, however, and it was not many days before Warren Tolliver learned that his niece had bought old Kestrel's abandoned car and was seen carrying papers to the depot office and asking Obadiah Finch pointed questions about survey records. He came to her one evening, uninvited, his boots loud on the frozen ground outside the car, and demanded to know what business a penniless girl thought she had digging through matters that were the railroad's concern and no one else's. Delia, for the first time in her life, did not flinch from him. She told him plainly that she knew what the true survey showed, that she had Kestrel's own hand as proof, and that she intended to see the homesteader's rightful claims restored. Warren's face, in the lamplight, went through several expressions before settling on something colder than anger, a kind of calculating fear, the look of a man realizing that his comfortable arrangement was suddenly, unexpectedly, at risk. He told her that no one would believe the ramblings of an abandoned rail car over the filed records of the Great Basin and Western, that the company had lawyers and money and she had nothing but a dead man's scribblings, and that if she pursued this foolishness she would find herself run out of Larkspur Hollow entirely, with not even the goodwill of a roof over her head. He reminded her, with a cruelty that was almost casual, that she had no family left to shield her, no standing in the town, nothing but a rotting boxcar and a fool's certainty. Delia listened to all of it without answering, and when he had finished she asked him only one question, whether he had known, when he came to enforce those evictions, that the boundary lines he carried were false. Warren did not answer, which was answer enough, and he left her that night with a threat rather than a promise, warning her that the company men in Cheyenne would not take kindly to interference and that she would do well to burn whatever papers she thought she had before someone burned them for her. Delia did not burn anything. Instead, she went the following morning to see the families whose homes stood in the balance, starting with old Silas Ashworth, whose oak table her father had built the year she was born, and she laid Kestrel's true survey before him alongside the falsified filing, and she watched a proud, weary man's face crumple with something between disbelief and vindication as 15 years of quiet, unexplained hardship suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. She went next to the Finches and then to the Palmers, and to each family she brought not accusation but evidence, painstakingly laid out, patient as joinery, until a dozen households understood together what none of them had understood alone. It was Silas Ashworth who suggested they take the matter not to the railroad's lawyers but directly to the federal land office in Cheyenne, since it was the government's own land grant that had been defrauded, and it was Obadiah Finch, with his decades of respectability and his careful memory of old filings, who agreed to travel with Delia to give the matter weight. They went together, the old stationmaster and the 19-year-old orphan, carrying Kestrel's journal, his true survey, and his intercepted correspondence, and they presented it to a land office clerk who at first seemed inclined to dismiss them, until he examined the survey markings closely enough to recognize their unmistakable precision and cross-referenced the dates against records the office itself still held, records that confirmed a surveyor named Josiah Kestrel had indeed been contracted for that very work in 1876 and had never filed a final report. The wheels of government turn slowly, but they turn most surely when a wrong can be shown plainly, joint by joint, and within a season an inquiry was opened into the Great Basin and Western's original filings, an inquiry that Warren Tolliver, as the company's man on the ground, could not simply outrun. The inquiry did what inquiries do, slowly and then all at once. The falsified boundary was overturned, the true survey lines restored, and the homesteads that had stood for 2 decades under threat of seizure were confirmed, at last, in the rightful ownership of the families who had built their lives upon them. The coal rights beneath the disputed acreage, which the railroad had hoped to claim entirely, were found to belong instead, in significant part, to those same homesteading families, a reversal that transformed hardship into unexpected, hard-won security for people who had spent 15 years believing their poverty was simply bad luck rather than quiet theft. Warren Tolliver, whose signature appeared on eviction notices built upon a survey he ultimately could not defend as accurate, was dismissed by the Great Basin and Western within the month, the company preferring, as companies do, to disown the agent rather than admit its own long history of fraud, and he left Larkspur Hollow the way he had once made others leave, quietly, without ceremony, without the town's goodwill to soften his departure. Delia did not gloat over it, for her father had raised her better than that, but she did feel, watching her uncle's wagon disappear down the same road she had once walked out on with $11, a settling of accounts that felt less like revenge and more like a plank finally sitting flush and true after years of warping. As for the gold Kestrel had hidden away as restitution money, Delia refused to keep a single coin of it for herself beyond what covered her own honest expenses, insisting instead that it be used exactly as the surveyor had intended 15 years before, distributed among the families whose claims had been wrongly threatened, with the remainder set aside to finally build the proper depot and spur repairs the railroad had once been paid for and never delivered, along with a small schoolhouse the town had wanted for a generation and never quite managed to afford. The old rail car itself, the $7 purchase that had seemed such foolishness on a cold October morning, was moved by the grateful town to a permanent spot beside the new depot, restored plank by plank, its dovetail joints sanded and oiled until they gleamed the way her father had once taught her fine woodwork ought to gleam, and it became in time, the very schoolhouse the town had dreamed of, a place where Larkspur Hollow's children would learn their letters inside the same walls where a forgotten surveyor had once hidden the truth and a forgotten girl had once found it. We began this story by telling you that Delia Mercer was 19 years old and had nothing in the world but $11 and the clothes on her back, cast out by an uncle who believed her worthless, foolish enough, by every practical measure, to spend 7 of those dollars on a rotting railroad car nobody else wanted. But we told you also that something sealed inside that car would change her life and restore a whole community, and now you understand why. Delia's inheritance from her father was never the workshop Warren Tolliver sold out from under her, nor any sum of money he might have owed her. It was a way of seeing, a patient, trained eye that looked past neglect and surface and asked what might be hidden beneath, a belief that nothing built with care is ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to notice. That belief was what let her recognize fine joinery beneath 15 years of dust, what let her trust an old surveyor's hidden compartment over her uncle's confident dismissal, what let her spend her last $7 on a thing everyone else had already written off. And in the end, it was not the gold that restored Larkspur Hollow, though the gold helped. It was Delia's willingness to trust what she saw was true, and to carry that truth patiently, piece by piece, until it could bear the weight of an entire town's justice. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Delia Mercer's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more worth than the world is willing to admit. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and your stories are often as remarkable as the ones we tell here. Until next time, stay close.